Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our ICNC Educational Webinar Series. My name is Maciej Bartkowski and I'm Senior Director for Research and Education at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. I will be the moderator for this webinar today. And with us we have Yvonne Marovic, who will introduce some key ideas from his new book, The Path of Most Resistance, a step-by-step guide to planning a nonviolent campaign. This is a practical guide for activists and organizers of all levels who wish to grow their resistance activities into more strategic campaign. Yvonne will tell stories and explain how the book guides readers through the campaign planning process, breaking it down into several steps and providing tools and exercises for each step. Today's webinar will be about an hour in length and will be based into two parts. The first part is a presentation by Yvonne that will last around 30 minutes, and then the next final part of the webinar will be Q&A, in which I will ask you to send in or ask live questions to Yvonne. So just briefly about the technical kind of issues with regard to the webinar. During this presentation, if you would like to minimize your control panel, you can by so clicking at the little red arrow at the top of your screen that points inward. And please don't worry about any background noise on your end, as all participants are muted except me and Yvonne, so that will not interfere with our audio. During Q&A portion, there are two ways to ask questions. One way, you can raise your hand and I will then unmute you and then you can ask your question live, or you can type your questions into the question box and then we will read that question to Yvonne to respond. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can, and if we don't get to your question, we will make sure that we'll send them to Yvonne and ask him to reply to the in a written format, and then we'll share that with registrants along the webinar recording. You can ask also your questions by sending us your feedback or questions to webinar@nonviolentconflict.org. We are also live tweeting the webinar from Civil Resistance @CivilResistance, and you can join our conversation and during and after the webinar on Twitter. You can also use hashtag ICNC webinars when you tweet and share any feedback about today's webinar. And recording of the webinar will be posted very soon after the end of this webinar on our website, and we'll share that with you once it's available. And we will welcome you on our Facebook page, as well as welcome your following of our Twitter account. So I will right now give screen to my colleague Yvonne, and I will introduce him briefly at the same time. So he will be setting up his PowerPoint presentation. So Yvonne Marovic was one of the leaders of Odpor movement, the student resistance movement that played a leading role in the overthrow of Serbian dictator Slobodan Milosevic in 2000. And after the successful democratic transition in Serbia, Yvonne began consulting with various pro-democracy movements around the world and became, in essence, one of the leading thinkers and practitioners in the field of strategic nonviolent resistance. So we are very happy to have him with us today for the next hour. And Yvonne, you can take it away at this moment.
Thank you, Maciej. And thanks, everyone. I'm really honored to be here and, to be able to talk a little bit about the book, The Path of Most Resistance, and, maybe some other things that will pop up during the course of the discussion. But let me just say that, I'm really thankful to ICNC for the support so this book actually is a result of a collaboration between me and the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. And And so I will, talk a little bit about the book, and we will probably, that is going to be the focus of this discussion. But maybe I should just start by saying something about me and why did I write this book in the first place. So I mean, when you look at the cover of the book, you will see this particular photo is on the front page. So let me just kind of say a few things about how this photo came about and what happened since it was taken. So I'm the battering ram in this photo, and I'm used to break the door of the deanery of the Belgrade University, so dean's office of the Belgrade University. This is in 1997, so like more than 20 years ago. And this was my first encounter with student organizing. I was one of the organizers of the student protest that took place in 1997. That student protest, after 4 months of daily demonstrations, failed to bring about change that we wanted to see. And so we spent the next couple of years trying to revive the protest and to kind of try the same thing in a different way. And that led us to the formation of Otpor. And I was one of the leaders of Otpor movement. In 2000, we managed to pull off the probably unprecedented level of mobilization in the history of Serbia, and to bring the record number of people to the voting stations, polling stations, in the historic 2000 vote. And then after Milosevic attempted to falsify elections, we managed to uh, with that level of mobilization, we managed to counter the electoral fraud, and he actually had to step down. So that was our, how shall I say, uh, big moment. And soon after that, so this is like year 2000, soon after that, both me and other of my colleagues, we were asked by people in different countries, in different parts of the world, if we could share our experiences with them, because they were facing more or less similar challenges, and especially when it comes to mobilization and using nonviolent method in when facing a much stronger opponent. So over the years, I together with others started approaching this in a more systematic way. So instead of like just telling stories, I kind of turned to training as a method, and that sort of education as a method to kind of uh, help people build their skills when it comes to using civil resistance and building social movements. So like it's been a long way since this photo, and I look a little bit different today. 20 more years and 20 more pounds than before. But the idea of the book was actually born in those 20 years. And as I was doing these trainings, and other of my colleagues were kind of doing a lot of trainings, I actually understood from that there is a need for some sort of a book or a reference which would be, let's say, a step-by-step guide where people can break down something that is very complex and very multifaceted, like a campaign, into a series of small steps where they can actually go from the first step of building the campaign to the final step, which is producing the campaign plan. And if that can be all presented in one book, I thought that would be a great idea. So I looked at the existing literature, and there was a lot of stuff that I found that was using case studies and presenting different campaigns and lessons learned from those campaigns. But what I found was a weakness in the existing literature was, this kind of, there was no really step-by-step guide. And especially there was no step-by-step guide which had an overview of all the planning tools that you can use when planning a campaign. There were these tools were presented and reviewed on different in different books or different online resources, but they were nobody compiled them in such a way that they are kind of all together. And another thing also that I thought would be good is to have attached lesson plans, so that you can actually, use the ideas presented in the book directly in the planning sessions or training sessions that you would do. So if you have, let's say, a group of people you're working with and you want to plan a campaign, these kind of plans would help you run a 12-hour long planning retreat, let's say. Or if you want to kind of educate members of your group or your colleagues in campaigning, when we talk about nonviolent broad-based campaigns, this would help you, these lesson plans would help you run that. So that was the idea. And so, when we were doing over the years in training movements in like how to approach civil resistance on a more strategic level, we kind of use this uh, pyramid called the strategy pyramid, and just kind of to distinguish between the strategic level of planning, which is long-term planning with the broad goals that take years that plan takes years to implement. And then each of these strategic plans is consisted of different campaigns, and these campaigns are a bit midterm. So, a campaign runs over a period of several months, maybe. And then within each of the campaigns, you have tactics, and there are the short-term uh, kind of elements of this strategic pyramid. So, we were as trainers training at different levels. And I kind of, when I was thinking about the guide, I thought that, it would be nice if we could have a guide for strategic planning, for campaign planning, and for tactical planning. But I decided to start with in the middle. And so this book is a step-by-step guide in planning nonviolent campaigns. So focuses on the campaign level, mid-level, so these are plans that take few months to implement. The reason why I kind of decided to start from the campaign level was that, campaigns serve as links between strategy and tactics, and at the same time they're the trickiest to pull off, because strategy is so long term that, the level of detail is not really big. The level of detail is broad enough so that if events change, you have time, because it takes years for the strategic plan to be implemented. It takes years, so you have time to adjust to the new circumstances. And on the tactical level, it's so short term that you will see the immediate results right away. So you will see whether you are on the right track or not. And campaigns, because they're in the middle, you start a campaign, you don't see the results right away. It will take few months for the results to be seen or to be visible. But then at the same time, you don't how should I say, if things happen, if new unexpected events happen, you cannot really redo the campaign in the middle of it, because it's too short. So it takes only a few months. So this is why kind of campaign planning, I believe, is most critical. It doesn't give you this kind of flexibility as a strategic plan does, because it takes years, and it doesn't give you this immediacy as a tactical level of planning, that, whatever it is, you will see the results in a few days. And this is why, decided to start the campaign levels. But as you can hear from this, I would really like, like sometime in the future to do a similar kind of guide for strategic level planning and tactical level planning. And so now the question is, how do you build a campaign? And the book is actually answering the question how you build the campaign in this step by step guide. And so when you build a campaign, you're thinking about three different levels. So first is the planning of the campaign. These are the things that you do before you even kind of start the first activity. And this is mostly figuring out what would be the objectives of the campaign, what would be the message of the campaign. And this is where this book can be really helpful to kind of help a lot with figuring out all these elements of a campaign plan. And then the next thing that is necessary for a campaign is its implementation, because all these activities and events need to be done, and all these, how should I say, messages have to go out in one form or another, either through flyers, posters, or speeches, or whatever it is. And then this is what is visible to the people who are kind of on the receiving end of the campaign. So they will see these activities. But then there is also things that are happening behind the scenes, and that is, how do you manage the campaign? Resources that are needed to pull it off, structure that is needed to support it, and then skills that people need to have. So as you can see, campaigning is a kind of multifaceted operation, and we cannot really have everything answered very easily. So the focus of this book is on the first question. So how do we plan a campaign? Because my kind of sense is that when we implement activities, or when we manage a campaign, there are a lot of things that are going to happen that are unforeseen, or there are a lot of things that are going to happen that are going to make things more difficult for us. But if we don't have the plan in place beforehand, then there will be too many moving parts in this machine. So the more planning we do, the more beforehand thinking we do, the better we will be when it comes to implementation and management. So when we talk about the campaign plan that is going to help us later, do the implementation and manage the resources, there are four things that are let's say, four questions that we need to answer, and this book helps us answer that. So the first is, what is our campaign objective, and what do we want to achieve with the campaign? The second question, which is kind of directly follows the first one, is, what is our message? What are we going to say in our campaign? What are we going to, because campaigns are operations that target general public. So you cannot have a campaign if you don't kind of have some sort of an influence on the general public. That's the main purpose of it. So we need to be kind of very clear before we start the campaign, what is our message and what do we say to the general public and to our, let's say, specific target audiences that we may have. And then another thing in the campaign plan is the pool of tactics, or the question that we ask here is, what are the things that we do in the campaign? What are the specific activities and events? So when we do the implementation later, we are not improvising. We already implement from the plan, from the pool of tactics that we already listed. And then finally, organization and resources, or at least an estimate of resources that is going to be needed, and the kind of organization that is going to be needed for the campaign also needs to be planned out, so that when we manage those resources and when we build those organizations to support the campaign, we start from somewhere. There is like a planned component of that. It's not improvised. So these are the four questions. What do we want to achieve? What are we going to say? What are we going to do? And how are we going to do it? These are the questions that the book tries to answer. So I'm just going to go through a number of tools that are used to answer these questions. And so we start in the book by looking at the situation we're in and the capacity that we have. And so we do it by using the SWOT analysis tool, that we look at the internal and the external factors, both positive and negative, that may influence the campaign that we are trying to run. So this is a pretty straightforward, very useful tool that people have been using in business, in politics, in nonprofit world, and it is very good to kind of analyze the current situation and the current capabilities of our campaign to do it. So answering these four questions that I said starts with understanding the situation and the current moment, taking the snapshot of the current moment. But we kind of follow that in the book directly by kind of some sort of anticipation of possible outcomes. So the current moment and the strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats that we identify can produce different scenarios. They are not really straightforward. First, they're not static, they will change, and then they will have an interplay between each other. So we follow the SWOT analysis by actually building possible scenarios, everything from the best case scenario to the worst case scenario, and all the scenarios in between. The idea there is to kind of create the range of options. That doesn't mean that like any of these scenarios that we are kind of outlining is going to be the one that is going to happen, but it's rather that these scenarios are going to produce boundaries within which the most likely scenario is going to happen, so that we are not surprised by events. We actually anticipated potential developments in the planning room, so when they happen in reality, we are not caught by surprise. And then when we have that, we are able to come up with a campaign objective, which is the answering the first question, that first of the four questions that I outlined. So the tool that we use to come up with a campaign objective is the SMART criteria. This is kind of also from the business world, from early 80s, and these criteria help us come up with a more concrete objective, so that we kind of are very specific, and we can measure these objectives and see if they are going to be achievable, and how relevant they are to our broader strategy, and when and how they're going to start and end, and how like they're going to be done in time. So after the SMART criteria are applied, we can say that the first element of the campaign plan is there, and that is the objective of the campaign is specified, and it's very, very concrete. And then we go into answering the second question, and so the book then focuses on the message. And the first step in building the message, now that we know the objective of the campaign, is to actually figure out the target audience. And we ask several questions here, like who are our potential allies in this campaign, and how enthusiastic are they to support us? Are they just going to like us on Facebook, or are they going to offer some resources and some sort of concrete support? We also ask ourselves who is on the other side and how enthusiastic are they to fight back, because some of them probably are, but some of them probably are not. And so this kind of analysis is important. And then the most interesting group there is the people who either don't care or they don't know what is going on, and they're unaware of the struggle that is taking place and the campaign, and they're, for one reason or another, they're undecided. So we use the spectrum of allies tool in the book for this, and to kind of analyze different target audiences, which kind of helps us identify in our campaign who are we going to target and when. So maybe we start with targeting our allies and potential allies. Maybe then in the later phase of the campaign we target neutrals, and then maybe even later we target some of those adversaries that are not so adversarial, let's say, that they're less enthusiastic. But that is a result of this tool. However, just pointing or putting people or putting groups on the spectrum is not enough to understand where they're coming from and how they feel about us and our campaign. So what we do after the spectrum of allies, it's followed by another tool, which is called the perception box. And perception box is, as you will see in the book, modeled after Tully's message box. That is kind of campaign tool that is used in politics. But this perception box actually helps us understand for each segment of the spectrum of allies where are they coming from, and so we can understand their beliefs and why do they hold these beliefs, and what do they think about us as the campaign and the issue that we're fighting for. So this kind of perception box helps us come up with a tailored message. So we have the objective. We use several tools for that. We have the message. We have several tools that we use to come up with the message. Then the book also helps us kind of organize a brainstorming session to come up with tactics and different other forms to convey that message. And also not just brainstorming, because brainstorming helps us kind of come up with a quantity of tactics. A lot of tactics can come out of brainstorming, but then this is followed by cost-benefit analysis, where we are actually using that tool to figure out which tactics would make more sense, either because they have a greater benefit or because they have lesser cost associated to that. And finally, for the last question, how do we do it, and how do we do organization and resources? This is the final part of the campaign plan, which kind of puts everything together and sees how this is going to be done, and it will help us later when we manage the campaign. And so there are very specific things that come out of that, and this is the campaign calendar, campaign organizational chart, campaign budget, but also something that is called campaign brief that you can use to communicate to let's say design firms, if marketing firms, if you are outsourcing that to the campaign, but also you can use it internally for building a campaign. And so, as I said, this was campaigns, and the book is on how to build a campaign plan. And I would like in the future, when I have time and when I have the kind of everything else that is needed, like focus and inspiration and determination, I would like to do similar guides on how to build a tactical plan or strategic plan. I guess the tactical planning guide would be much quicker and shorter, but on the other hand, this is going to be offset by the more strategic planning guide, which will probably take more. So that's how I'm thinking, but it's it would be pretty much along the same lines and using the same format like this one. So that's just kind of something that I'm thinking about. And so that is pretty much the book in a nutshell. It's kind of not very it's not kind of a good idea to talk about the book. It's better to kind of just have people read it. But I hope that this presentation that I just had will show you that topics that are covered in the book are very practical, very kind of specific to kind of helping people come up with either a campaign planning workshop or a training workshop which teaches people how to plan campaigns. So thank you.
Great. Yes, great. Thank you, Ivan. Thank you for this insightful and very neatly and structural done presentation in the same way we would want our nonviolent campaigns to be done as well. So I will just remind the participants by showing them my screen for a moment of how they can ask the questions. So you can raise your hand in the menu or panel that you have, and I will unmute you and I will ask you to go ahead ask the live question to Ivan. Or alternatively, you can also type your question in the questions box, and I will then read those questions to Ivan. So please take a moment, and I will check whether we have any of the participants raising their hands. I see a couple of them. Before I will call on one of the participants to ask the question, Ivan, I wanted to ask you kind of general question about your experience of doing trainings in recent years of working with young activists and presenting, those tools, and then thinking about yourself, 20 or 30 years earlier in terms of, you being an activist. What would be the differences that you may have noticed in the way that young activists, approach the kind of strategizing around the campaign, and how you did with your colleagues in your earlier days, and what are perhaps the challenges or opportunities that you see while you interact with this new generation of activists that might be different or similar in terms of how they think, how they strategize in comparison with what you experienced in your youth years when you were, breaking the doors with your head and forcing your agenda and goals with your colleagues in non-violent way.
Yeah. So I think it's kind of a mixed bag. Some things are changed for the better, some things change for the worse, and it's how to say, if I can say, some of these tools that are in the book, we used to use these tools in our planning, like in the 90s, for instance, like like a perception box. Although we didn't use the perception box, it still wasn't developed. So we used the traditional message box developed by Charles Tully, and that helped us kind of understand like the people that we were trying to target. So we had some of the tools already then, but nothing compared to what is available now. And so what I see is that people are have a much wider range of tools that they're using. People today have it kind of we another thing was that we were in we lived in the stone age of the internet in the 90s, so the online resources were not so kind of vast as they are today. And what I see with people who are planning today is that availability of online planning resources is much greater. But it kind of leads to another kind of aspect, which I think is the downside, and maybe a bit problematic, is that and I always say, like, when they ask, is there an app for that? Is there like an automated way that you can do some of this planning? And so I think that, the fact that we had to do a lot of things manually, and that it was kind of much more difficult to do. Sometimes lack of resources makes you resourceful, so you're kind of coming up with the ideas because you just are forced by kind of limited opportunities or possibilities. So you kind of overcome that through greater creativity. And this is where I see, how shall I say, the kind of room for improvement today, and that this kind of numerous resources that are out there that help you do the planning and structure things, also do not put you in a tough spot where you kind of have to think differently. And so kind of like, well, as an example, you can always say, we'll just post it on Facebook, and this is how we're going to reach out to people, because that is so easy. But that means that you don't spend time thinking about other ways you can reach people.
Thanks, Ivan. So I see at least two hands being raised, and I will unmute Real Khalifa. Real, please go ahead, introduce yourself and ask a question.
Hello, good afternoon. Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you well.
Okay, wonderful. My name is Real Khalifa, and I've actually spoken to you guys. I've attended a couple webinars from ICNC, which I sincerely appreciate. I think your book is fantastic, and it is a helpful guide for activists to organize their campaigns. It's also helpful for students like myself who are analyzing nonviolent movements. And my question to you is, has OTPOR ever provided training sessions for activists, particularly the Girifna movement, which is an Arabic word for we are disgusted? It's similar to the Kifaya movement in Egypt. Has OTPOR ever worked with activists from Sudan?
So how should I say, now the OTPOR doesn't exist for the last like almost like 15 years, maybe even more. And OTPOR was a movement that operated strictly in Serbia and was focused on bringing about political and social change in the country. So after the successful OTPOR movement, after the success, OTPOR movement shortly thereafter ceased to exist. And by 2003, it was completely defunct as an organization. But it was a fast movement. It was like tens of thousands of people, and we can say thousands of really skillful organizers. And a lot of these people were invited by a number of groups around the world to kind of share their experiences and to talk about things that we did. And some of the OTPOR activists went further and became like skillful trainers and consultants. Some started working in kind of supporting pro-democracy groups through other forms of organizing, and in international organizations or whatever. But it is actually very difficult to kind of track who was kind of in communication with whom on an individual basis, because there's so many people. But OTPOR as an organization wasn't involved in any of that while it still existed.
Thank you, Ivan. I would unmute right now Rivera-san. Rivera, please go ahead and introduce yourself and ask a question.
Hi, Yvonne. It's nice to hear from you after learning from you during the James Lawson Institute in 2014. You're such a great presenter, and I really want to affirm that talking about the book in presentations like this is actually really helpful for reading the book, which I'm doing right now. My question to you is in your experience, is there an optimal size range for strategic planning groups? Like, could one person sit down and mastermind the whole thing? Or is there a threshold of hundreds or thousands of people that is just overload in a campaign design strategic planning session?
That's an excellent question, and yes, these are two conflicting numbers. The smaller the number, it's easier to manage. The easiest number of people to manage is 0, and you don't need to manage anyone. But the more people you have in the planning process, the more ideas and the more, because it's not just that each person individually brings an idea. So if you have 3 people, you have 3 ideas, but if you have 6 people, you have 6 ideas. But if you have 3 people, you have more connections than when you have 2. When you have 2 people, you have only 2 connections. When you have 3 people, you have 3 connections. But when you have 4 people, then you have 6 connections between. So the more people you have, then the combinations of ideas explode. So you would want to have more people involved in the planning process. However, managing that is difficult. So I usually kind of talk about like 2 numbers in any kind of organizing. But if you're organizing a strategic planning workshop, the same would apply. The first number I call the dinner number, and the second one is the Dunbar number. That is kind of, so let me start with the Dunbar number. Dunbar number is this guy came up with this number, and he said, what is the biggest number of people in the village that doesn't need the police force? And he came up, this is the number of 150. And so what he had in mind there is that, like, you can be in touch with 150 people and pretty much know where they are on something. You cannot be in kind of everyday communication with them, but you can, how should I say, consult with them. So having like a Dunbar number of people around the campaign planning is helpful, because you can bounce back ideas, and it's a manageable number of people. But for the planning itself, now we're talking about the dinner number, and the question here is, what is the maximum number of guests that you can have at the dinner table so that you all still have a single dinner conversation? And that number is, strangely around a dozen. So it's like the Last Supper, or something like that. So, but it's usually, when you ask people what is that number, they usually say it's like somewhere between 10 and 15, they may be up to 20. But it is important that, like, when you are planning a campaign, that you have a planning team that has that number of people, around a dozen, maybe 15, so that they can be part of the same conversation. And when you have larger groups, that they are given different specific and distinct tasks within the campaign, so that you keep your teams that are planning within that manageable number. Small enough so they are part of the same conversation, but not too small so that you can have the idea generation, which is kind of important to have a campaign planning process that kind of bursts with ideas.
Thank you, Ivan. Since we are touching on the kind of organizational issue, I've got a question from one of the participants in the audience who says that this is a wonderful resource. Would like to share portions of your book in training workshops that are shorter in length than you recommended 12 hours. Our trainings will be around 3 hours, and also we'll be working with members of multiple organizations simultaneously. So do you have recommendations for how to adapt your work for shorter trainings with multiple organization groups?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do actually, and that's a good kind of point. Is that the book is structured in a way that you have an overview of a particular tool, followed by a step-by-step guide how to use that tool and kind of an estimate of the time that is needed for that particular tool. So at the end of the book, you know, there is the lesson plan for a 12-hour long kind of campaign planning process. And that campaign planning process leads you from, you know, point one to the last step of the campaign plan. So you would, after these 12 hours, come up with a campaign plan. But because the book, most of the book is actually the overview of very specific tools with very specific step-by-step guides how to use each particular tool, you can, it's a kind of modular in a sense. You can kind of rearrange them, take some of them, leave some others out, and you can come up with your own kind of lesson plans that maybe are 3 hours for a 3-hour long session. You just kind of have to figure out which aspect of that you want to cover. So you can have a 3-hour long, let's say, session that is focused solely on situation analysis and where we are and what are our capabilities and what are the things that we may do based on the potential outcomes. And or you may have a different session which is totally focused on brainstorming tactics. And when we do brainstorm tactics, how do we then pick those tactics that are more appropriate to our situation? Or you can have another training which is 3 hours long, which is focused on understanding the target and coming up with the message that is appropriate for that target. And it doesn't need to be a campaign. You can use that, for instance, if you want to send a letter to someone, you can analyze the target of that letter or the recipient of that letter, analyze their perceptions, and then come up with the right way to formulate that letter. So you know, the tools can be used for other things, and this is why the book is structured in a way so that the tools are first presented, and only then at the end of the book they're put in order so that you kind of have that 12-hour long campaign planning session.
Thank you, Ivan. I've got like a short follow-up question on this kind of organizational issue, but I may give you a screen so you can show your slides. My question, it goes back to the slide of when you've got campaign plan and you've got then planning, implementation, management. So you can maybe display that slide. It was at the very beginning of your
yes.
presentation. Right, and my question is short in terms of the percentage of time that you would recommend activists to spend on each of those phases. I know that you covered, you know, planning, but would there be like a rule of thumb that this is the amount of time that probably at minimum one has to think for planning in order then to have effective implementation and management? And again, and this is the amount of time for implementation in order to think about effective impact of those activities, and then the same thing for management. So if you think about in terms of the amount of time that one should think about spending for each of those 3 phases, what would be in percentage terms, and why?
Yeah, so I would say that like planning is, you know, something that happens before you start the campaign, and in a sense, the time you have to plan, the better. The problem there is that if you take too long, that the events are going to how shall I say, make your plans obsolete. So that is kind of what you need to always have in mind, that you can't spend like 6 months planning, and then in those 6 months who knows what is going to happen. But I think that the planning phase is important to be seen as distinct from implementation and management, because the it can be done before, and it's actually better if like the planning and all these questions are asked in the room before we go out in the street, because it's much more difficult to answer these questions once the implementation starts, because like unexpected events are there. And so then when we talk about implementation and management and percentages here, so these kind of campaigns, and you will see when you read the book that this is not a front-loaded like traditional campaign which is run by a marketing team, which spends a lot of times on TV ads and posters and stuff. So this is a grassroots campaign. This is a campaign that is built and implemented from the bottom up. So when we talk about implementation, when we talk about activities, events, tactics that are going to be done, we're mostly talking about volunteers that are going to do that. They're organizers of the campaign, maybe professionally tied to the campaign, but in many cases they're not. They're also volunteers. But people who are kind of carrying the campaign for most of the time are volunteers. And so when we talk about the implementation of these campaigns, we usually talk about their free time, and it's not a full-time job. And this is also kind of important when we talk about management of skills and resources. And you will see in the book, the kind of when you're coming up with the campaign calendar or the campaign organization chart, these are the things that are important, so that for instance, that all your major activities for the campaign are, let's say, taking place on Saturdays, because people don't go to work and they're able to participate in these events. Let's say that's one way to look at it. Or you may decide that the meetings that are necessary are only taking place in the evening when people can come. So the similar thing is for the budget, because a lot of that that we're thinking about the campaign actually can be done if we mobilize local resources, so that we don't have to pay upfront as a campaign team for a particular service that we are offering. And I always remember when we as Otpor were supported by like local small businesses, one of them was a local coffee roasting shop, which was giving us coffee whenever we had like regular press conferences. So they would kind of give us coffee for the press conference, so we can give the journalists some beverages. And so our kind of deal with them was that we would get, like, let's say $50 worth of donations in coffee from them. So for us, that was $50, because this is how much we would pay in the store. For them, it was $20, because they are the supplier of coffee. So they would spend $20 to give us $50. And this kind of resource management that is only possible in grassroots campaigns, where you develop these local partnerships, where you bring in people who are already in your local community, actually allows you to do that. So in the same sense, to go back to time, careful management of the time that volunteers can offer can actually increase the effect of their work and their effort in the maybe limited time that they may have for the campaign.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. So I've got two questions that are quite similar, and they basically touch on the kind of mindset of some of the activists. That one of the participants is writing that basically he sees more the kind of intuitive approach to waging nonviolent campaigns, and how those people could be basically convinced to implement the tools that you presented. And another person saying that there are a lot of activists who are not interested in campaign planning. They just want to go on the streets and protest. How would you persuade them to invest in the campaign planning itself? So both of them are raising the kind of cultural issue of some of the activists or some of the people that basically are either not interested in campaign planning, doing this meticulous work, or even culturally predisposed and preferring action from what they may perceive as an inaction in terms of the planning. So how could those people be reached out to and kind of persuaded to use your book, use your tools in the activism?
Yeah, actually, at the end of the book, I have a quote by Dwight Eisenhower. After I finished the book talking about the campaign plan, I finish it with a quote that planning is when you make your plan, when you finish making your plan, you can throw it out of the window, and because planning is everything, but plan is nothing. And so what Eisenhower wanted to say is that more important than a specific campaign plan is the kind of process that you're going through when you're planning, and that is actually to understand your environment, to understand your capabilities, to understand other players in the field and what are their perceptions, what are their motivations, what are they capable of doing, and to come up with the right course of action. And so if you have that understanding, then you can improvise, then you can shoot from the hip, because you have those understanding. And so in the same way that great cooks don't need recipes, great chefs, they don't follow a recipe. They know, they are all talking about different cooking techniques and different ingredients and how they're going to use these ingredients, but they don't have to follow a recipe. And in the same way, I'm sure great campaigners don't need to do this kind of step-by-step campaign planning process, because it happens naturally in their mind. They totally internalized it. And so I would like to see a world where people don't use these tools, but they actually, are capable of understanding the dynamics, especially political dynamics, in a way that they come up with an appropriate response to every possible challenge that exists in politics. Some are more talented to do that, and they will do it much more quickly. Some others may need more time to do it. But but I believe that this book is one of the books that can help us learn how to plan, so that we don't have to have any particular plans in place. We can do planning, how shall I say, as we go and as a continuous process.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, Yvonne, I would like to thank you for, again, very insightful presentation and very informative responses to the questions that we received. We actually received many more questions that will be shared with you for your possible feedback, so then we can get back to participants. I just want to remind participants that we recorded that webinar and we'll be sharing this with all those who registered. And also, once we finish the webinar, there would be a window that would pop up with a short evaluation survey, and we will appreciate your feedback. And finally, there were one or two questions about the manual itself. Yes, that manual is available on our website, on the ICNC website, could be downloaded freely for your use in your own activism, as well as in your trainings with other activists. Even before I end the webinar, would you like to say the final word here?
Yes, I would just like to thank everyone for their attention and for spending the last hour, and encourage you to check out the book if you haven't already. And if how shall I say, if campaign planning as a process is something that looks too big of a deal, or too scary, or too difficult, or whatever, you can do it one tool at a time, step by step, and in no time you will go through the whole campaign planning process that is laid out in the book. But thank you again, and thanks to ICNC.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon, everyone, or good evening. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.